Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going deep into the world of drug addiction, but we're doing it with a twist.
That's right. We're taking a close look at the differences between men and women when it comes to substance abuse.
And let me tell you, the research we dug into for this one is seriously eye-opening. Like, get ready to have some assumptions challenged.
I agree. We often talk about addiction as if it affects everyone the same way, but when you really start to break it down, the reality is a lot more, well, complicated.
Totally. And it gets even more complex when you consider the differences between men and women, both in how they experience addiction and how they're treated for it.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, there's still a lot of misunderstanding out there, even within the medical community.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. We've got a mountain of research here. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was the biological differences between men and women when it comes to substance abuse.
Right, and this is where things get really interesting. So for a long time, the dominant narrative was that men were just more likely to become addicted. And while that might have been true based on the data we had at the time, it didn't really explain why.
Exactly. Like, what was it about being male that made someone more susceptible to addiction?
Well, what we're finding now is that it's not quite that simple. It's
Yeah.
not just about being male or female. It's about the biological differences between the sexes and how those differences can influence the way the body processes drugs.
So it's not just about willpower or some innate moral failing. There's actually a physical difference at play here.
Exactly. For example, did you know that women have fewer stomach enzymes than men?
I did not. Is that bad? What does that mean?
Well, it can have a significant impact on how their bodies metabolize certain drugs. Fewer enzymes mean that substances can stay in a woman's system for longer and become more concentrated.
Oh, wow. So it's like their bodies are processing things differently right from the start.
Precisely. And then you add in the fact that women generally have more fatty tissue than men.
Okay. And what does that have to do with anything?
Well, many drugs, especially those that are fat-soluble, tend to accumulate in fatty tissue. This can further increase the concentration of these substances in women's bodies, leading to more intense and potentially longer-lasting effects.
So it's like a double whammy then.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that we're also seeing evidence that women may experience cravings differently. Like they might start craving a substance sooner after using it, even after just one or two times, which can make it a lot harder to quit.
That makes sense. It's like their brains are being wired differently in response to the drugs.
Right, and that's not all. Studies are also showing that women might be more vulnerable to relapse even after long periods of abstinence, which is something we need to be much more aware of when we're talking about treatment and recovery.
Okay, so we're starting to see how biology plays a huge role. But I know we've also got some research here on the connection between chronic pain and addiction, which seems particularly relevant to women.
Absolutely. Chronic pain is a massive issue that disproportionately affects women. And when you consider how debilitating chronic pain can be, it's not surprising that many people, especially women, turn to painkillers for relief.
Which, as we know, can be a slippery slope towards addiction. So we're talking about things like prescription opioids, right?
Yes, but it's not just prescription opioids. We're also seeing an increase in women becoming addicted to over-the-counter painkillers, especially as they try to manage chronic pain without relying on prescriptions.
So it's like this vicious cycle. They're in pain, so they seek relief, but the relief itself can lead to a whole other set of problems.
And this is where it's so important to remember that addiction is not a moral failing. It's a complex medical condition that's influenced by a whole range of factors, including biology, genetics, and environment.
You're right, it's not about willpower. And when you start to look at the numbers surrounding chronic pain in women, it's pretty alarming. I think I read that.
70% of those diagnosed with chronic pain are women. It's a staggering statistic.
70%. Seriously. That's huge.
It is. And what's even more concerning is that women often experience chronic pain for longer durations and at higher intensities compared to men. They're also more likely to be diagnosed with pain conditions that are more difficult to treat, like fibromyalgia and migraines.
So they're not only more likely to experience chronic pain, but also more likely to be dealing with it for longer periods and with more intensity. That's got to take a toll both physically and emotionally.
It absolutely does. And unfortunately, it can also make them more likely to be prescribed higher doses of painkillers or to be prescribed them for longer periods, which, again, increases their risk of developing an addiction.
It's like this perfect storm for women. But hold on a second. We're about to get into some even heavier stuff when we come back. We'll be right back after a quick break. All right, we're back. And before the break, we were talking about chronic pain and how it disproportionately affects women. But let's be honest, it's not just the physical pain that makes this whole issue so complex, is it?
It's so much more than that. We can't talk about women and addiction without acknowledging the huge impact of societal expectations and the stigma surrounding substance abuse.
Right. It's like women are held to this different standard, this expectation that they need to be perfect, that they need to be the caregivers, the ones who hold it all together.
Exactly. And when you're struggling with addiction, it can feel impossible to live up to those expectations, which often leads to shame, guilt, and this fear of judgment.
And that shame and fear can be paralyzing. It can prevent women from seeking help, from reaching out for support when they need it most.
Absolutely. And we can't underestimate the impact of trauma.
Yeah.
Our research showed that there's a strong correlation between trauma and addiction in women. Like, a significant percentage of women in treatment for substance abuse have experienced some form of trauma in their lives.
That's heartbreaking, but unfortunately not surprising.
No, it's not. And when you start to look at the types of trauma that women are more likely to experience, things like sexual assault, domestic violence, even emotional abuse, it's clear that we need to be having a very different conversation about women and addiction.
Because it's not happening in a vacuum. It's often connected to these deeply painful experiences that have long-lasting effects.
Exactly. And for many women, turning to drugs or alcohol is a way to cope with that trauma, to numb the pain, to escape from the emotional turmoil they're experiencing.
It's just not just about seeking pleasure, it's about seeking relief.
Exactly. And it's essential to remember that these traumas often don't just disappear. They can continue to affect a woman's mental, emotional, and even physical health long after the traumatic event has passed.
Which can make recovery that much more challenging. But even beyond trauma, women are dealing with so many other pressures that can contribute to addiction. I mean, let's talk about the pressure cooker that is modern motherhood for a second.
Oh, absolutely. The pressure on women to be perfect mothers, to do it all, and to make it look easy is insane.
And let's be real, motherhood is hard enough even without the added stress of addiction. But when you throw that into the mix, it's like trying to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle on a tightrope. It's no wonder that so many women turn to substances just to cope with the overwhelm.
It's true. And then you layer on top of that the very real societal and economic challenges that women face every single day. The gender pay gap, the lack of affordable childcare, the pressure to be the primary caregiver. And it's like, how could anyone be surprised that women are struggling?
It's like we're setting women up to fail, and then we blame them when they reach a breaking point.
It's a perfect storm, and it's creating a crisis. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about what to do if you or someone you love might be struggling with addiction. The first step is recognizing the signs.
Yeah, because it's not always as obvious as you might think. So what should people be on the lookout for?
One of the biggest red flags is needing more and more of the substance to achieve the desired effect, what we call building a tolerance. This can happen with just about any substance, from alcohol to prescription painkillers to illicit drugs.
So if you find yourself needing an extra drink or two to relax, or if you're constantly upping your dose of painkillers, that's a sign that something might be off.
Exactly. And another major red flag is experiencing withdrawal symptoms when you try to cut back or quit. These symptoms can be physical, like nausea, sweating, tremors, or even seizures, or they can be psychological, like anxiety, insomnia, or depression.
That makes sense. Our bodies and minds become dependent on the substance, so when we take it away, it's like our system goes into shock.
Right. And these withdrawal symptoms can be so unpleasant, even dangerous in some cases, that they often prevent people from trying to quit in the first place. It becomes this vicious cycle.
So let's say someone recognizes these signs, either in themselves or in a loved one. What's the next step?
That's a really good question. And it takes a lot of courage to even get to the point where you're willing to ask for help.
You're absolutely right. It can feel really overwhelming, even scary.
For sure. So where do you even begin?
Well, one option is to talk to your doctor. They can assess your situation, provide medical advice, and even connect you with resources in your community.
So they can kind of be like a guide to help navigate all of this. Exactly. And there are also hotlines and websites that offer confidential support and information, like the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, has a national helpline that's available 24/7.
Okay, that's good to know. And I know there are also a lot of different treatment options out there depending on the severity of the addiction and the individual's needs.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to addiction treatment. What works for one person might not work for another. But in general, some common treatment options include things like therapy, support groups, and in some cases, medication-assisted treatment.
Can we break those down a bit? Like, what exactly does therapy involve and how can it help with addiction?
Sure. So therapy can be incredibly beneficial for people with addiction because it provides a safe and supportive space to explore the underlying causes of their addiction, develop coping mechanisms, and learn healthier ways to manage their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
So it's not just about stopping the substance use, it's about addressing all of the other stuff that might be contributing to the addiction in the first place.
Precisely. And there are different types of therapy that can be helpful too. Some people benefit from individual therapy, where they work one-on-one with a therapist, while others find group therapy to be really helpful because it provides a sense of community and allows them to connect with others who understand what they're going through.
Right, like that sense of not being alone in this can be so powerful.
Absolutely. And then there are support groups, which can be a great resource for people in recovery. Groups like Narcotics Anonymous, NA, and Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, offer peer support and a structured program that can help people stay sober and rebuild their lives.
I've heard a lot of people talk about how helpful those 12-step programs can be. It's like having
Yeah.
this whole community of people who get it, who've been there themselves.
Exactly. And for some people, medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, can be a really effective option. This involves using medications, along with counseling and behavioral therapies, to help people manage their addiction and reduce cravings and withdrawal symptoms.
So it's like the medications are a tool to help manage the physical aspects of addiction, while the therapy and support groups address the psychological and social aspects.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that addiction is a chronic disease, just like diabetes or heart disease, which means that relapse is possible. But it's not a sign of failure. It just means that the treatment plan might need to be adjusted or that the person needs additional support. The most important thing is to encourage them to keep trying and to remind them that recovery is a journey, not a destination.
That's a really important message, and I think it speaks to the
Hmm.
need for compassion and understanding when it comes to addiction.
100%. We need to move away from this blame and shame mentality and create a culture where people feel safe asking for help without fear of judgment.
Couldn't agree more. Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. As we wrap up, is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
I think the biggest takeaway here is that addiction is not a sign of weakness, and it doesn't discriminate. It affects people of all genders, races, socioeconomic backgrounds. Anyone can be touched by this. The more we understand about addiction, the more equipped we'll be to support those who are struggling and create a world where recovery is possible for everyone.
Beautifully said. And for anyone out there listening who's struggling, please know that you're not alone, and there is hope. Don't be afraid to reach out for help. There are people who care about you and want to support you on your journey to recovery. And remember, every day is a new opportunity to make a positive change. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.